And that was Time War by a Wild Nobility. Great name for a band, that. Good song too. Now, if I haven't scared you off in the first hour by informing you that Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, is actually a god, and you're still here, welcome to the second hour of the Velocity of Now with me, your host, Thomas Sheridan, on the Type 1 Radio Network. We have Steve at the controls tonight. First show of the new year, 2014. Website, www.thomassheridanarts.com. Anything you can do there to help me out, buy a book, whatever. I'd be very, very grateful. Keep this show on the road. I feel like my best is yet to come. And I want to share this journey with as many people as I possibly can. By the way, I want to do a special thanks to the people who listen and download this show, because the Velocity of Now finished the highest rated show on the BTR network in the arts and culture category, ahead of even the New York Times book review. We're pulling them in, folks. That's why I do the comedy bits. That's why I bring in all the other stuff, because we're not going to take the purple pill and be sucked back into the mainstream. This is one of the few shows that's taken people from the mainstream and bringing them to our side. Now, second hour. We're going to talk about science fiction. What does it mean? What's it about? What's the difference between American and British science fiction? But first, before I do that, would you please bear with me for the next 15 to 20 minutes? And I'm going to read you a story by Arthur C. Clarke called The 9 Billion Names for God. It's a highly acclaimed short story, science fiction short story from 1953. It won all kinds of awards back in the day, and it launched Arthur C. Clarke, although he was selected beforehand, and I'll be talking about this later in the hour, as the great science fiction author he was to become. Now, this short story is basically a blueprint for the new secular religion, the religion of technology, spoken in an allegorical term in a hell of a lot of Freemasonic language. But if you please listen to me read this and listen carefully, I think you will find it very revealing. It's also a cracker of a story as well. Now, it won't take more than 20 minutes, if even, to read this out. The 9 Billion Names for God, Arthur C. Clarke. This is a slightly unusual request, said Dr. Wagner, with what he hoped anyone's been asked to supply a Tibetan monastery with an automatic sequencing computer. I don't wish to be inquisitive, but I should hardly have thought that your establishment had much use for such a machine. Could you explain just what you intend to do with it? Gladly, replied the Lama, readjusting his silk robes and carefully putting away the slide rule he had been using for currency conversions. Your Mark IV computer can carry out any routine mathematical operation involving up to 10 digits. However, for our work we are interested in letters, not numbers, and we wish you to modify the output circuit so the machine will be printing words, not columns of figures. I don't quite understand. This is a project on which we have been working for the last 3 centuries. Since the Lamasery was founded, in fact, it is somewhat alien to your way of thought, so I hope you will listen with an open mind as I explained it. Naturally. It's really quite simple. We have been compiling a list which shall contain all the possible names of God. I beg your pardon? We have reason to believe, continued the Lama, that all such names can be written with not more than 9 letters in an alphabet we have devised. And you have been doing this for 3 centuries? Yes, we expect it would take us about 15,000 years to complete the task. Oh, Dr. Wagner looked a little dazed. Now I see why you wanted to hire one of our machines. But exactly what is the purpose of this project? The Lama hesitated for a fraction of a second, and then Wagner wondered if he had offended him. If so, there was no trace of annoyance in his reply. Call it ritual if you like, but it's a fundamental part of our belief. All the many names of the Supreme Being, God, Jehovah, Allah, and so on, they are only man-made labels. This is also a philosophical problem of some difficulty here, which I do not propose to discuss, but somewhere along all possible combinations of letters that can occur are what one may call the real names of God. By systematic permutation of letters, we have been trying to list them all. I see. You've been starting with A, and working up to Z. Exactly. Though we use a special alphabet of our own, modifying the electromagnetic typewriters to deal with this, of course. Trivial. A rather more interesting problem is that of devising suitable circuits to eliminate ridiculous combinations. For example, no letter must occur more than 3 times in succession. 3, surely you mean 2. 3 is correct. I'm afraid I would take too long to explain why, even if you understood our language. I'm sure it would, said Wagner hastily. Go on. Luckily, it will be a simple matter to adapt your automatic sequencing computer for this work. Since once it has been reprogrammed properly, it will permute each letter in turn and print the result. What would have taken us 15,000 years, we'll be able to do in 100 days. Dr. Wagner was scarcely conscious of the faint sounds from Manhattan Street far below. He was in a different world, a world of natural, not man-made mountains. High up in the remote areas, these monks had been patiently at work, generation after generation, compiling lists of meaningless words. Was there any limit to the follies of mankind? Still, he must give no hint of his inner thoughts. The customer is always right. There is no doubt, replied the doctor, that we can modify the Mark V print list of this nature. I'm much more worried about the problem of installation and maintenance. Getting it out to the Tibet in these days is not going to be easy. We can arrange that. The components are small enough to travel light by air. That is one reason why we chose your machine. It can get them to India and will provide transport from there. And you want to hire 1 or 2 of our engineers? Yes, for the 3 months that the project should occupy. I've no doubt that personnel can manage that, Dr. Wagner scribbled a note on his desk pad. There are just 2 other points. Before we could finish the sentence, the Lama had produced a small slip of paper. This is my certified credit balance at the Asiatic Bank. Thank you. It appears to be adequate. The second matter is so trivial that I hesitate to mention it, but it's surprising how often the obvious gets overlooked. What source of electrical energy have you? A diesel generator providing 50 kilowatts at 110 volts. It was installed about 5 years ago and it's quite reliable. It made life at the monastery much more comfortable, but of course it was really installed to provide the power for the motors driving the prayer wheels. Of course, echoed Dr. Wagner. I should have thought of that. The view from the parapet was vertical, but in time one gets used to anything. After 3 months, George Hanley was not impressed by the 2,000-foot swoop into the abyss or the remote checkerboard of fields in the valley below. He was leaning against the wind-smoothed stones, staring morosely at the distant mountains whose names he had never bothered to discover. This, thought George, was the craziest thing that had ever happened to him. Project Shangri-La, some wit back at the labs had christened it. For weeks now, the Mark V had been churning out acres of sheets covered with gibberish. Patiently, inexorably, the computer had been rearranging letters in all their possible combinations, exhausting each class before going on to the next. As the sheets had emerged from the electromagnetic typewriters, the monks had carefully cut them up and pasted them into an enormous box. In another week, heaven be praised, they would have finished. Just what obscure calculations had convinced these monks that they needed bother to go on to words of 10, 20 or 100 letters, George didn't know. One of his recurring nightmares that there would be some change of plan and that the High Lama would suddenly announce the project would be extended to approximately AD 2060. They were quite capable of it. George heard the wooden door slam in the wind and Chuck came out onto the parapet beside him. As usual, Chuck was smoking one of the cigars that made him so popular with the monks, who it seemed were quite willing to embrace all the minor and most of the major pleasures of life. That was one thing in their favour. They might be crazy, but they weren't blue noses. Those frequent trips they took down to the village, for instance. Listen, George, said Chuck urgently. I've learned something that means trouble. What's wrong? Isn't the machine behaving? That was the worst contingency George could imagine. It might delay his return, and nothing could be more horrible. The way he felt it now, even the slight sight of the TV commercial would seem like a manna in heaven. At least it would be some linked with home. No, it's nothing like that. Chuck settled himself on the parapet, which was unusual because normally he was scared of the drop. I've just found what all this is about. What do you mean? I thought we knew. Sure, we know what the monks are trying to do, but we didn't know why. It's the craziest thing. Tell me something now, growled George. But old Sam just come clean at me. You know, the way he drops in every afternoon to watch the sheets roll out, well, this time he seemed rather excited, or at least as near as he ever got to it. When I told him that we were on the last cycle, he asked me, in that cute English accent of his, if I'd ever wondered what we were trying to do. I said, sure. He told me, go on, I'll buy it. Well, they believe that when they have listed all of his names, and they reckon that there are about 9 billion of them, God's purpose will be achieved. The human race will have finished what it was created to do, and there won't be any point in carrying on. Indeed, the very idea is something like blasphemy. That's what they expect us to do, commit suicide. There's no need for that. When the list is completed, God steps in and simply winds things up. Bingo! Oh, I get it. So when we finish our job, it'll be like the end of the world. Chuck gave a nervous little laugh. That's just what I said, Sam. And you know what happened? He looked at me in a very queer way, like I was been stupid in class, and said, it's nothing as trivial as that. George thought this over for a moment. That's what I call taking the wide view, he said presently. But what do you suppose we should do about it? I don't see that it makes the slightest difference to us. After all, we already knew they were all crazy. Yes, but don't you see what may have happened? When the list is complete and the last trump doesn't blow, or whatever the trumpet doesn't blow, or whatever they don't expect, we may get the blame. It's our machine they're using. I don't like the situation one bit. I see, said George. You got a point there, all right. But this sort of thing's happened before, you know. When I was a kid down in Louisiana, we had a crackpot preacher who once said the world was going to end next Sunday. Hundreds of people believed him, even sold their homes. Yet when nothing happened, they didn't turn nasty, as you'd expect. They just decided that he'd made a mistake in his calculations and went right on believing. I guess some of them still do. Well, this isn't Louisiana, in case you noticed. There are just 2 of us and hundreds of these monks. I like them, and I'll be sorry for old Sam when his life work backfires to him, but all the same, I wish I was somewhere else. I've been wishing that for weeks, but there's nothing we can do until the contract's finished and the transport arrives to fly us out. Of course, said Chuck thoughtfully. We could always try a bit of sabotage. Like hell we could. That would make things worse. No, not that way, I mean. Look at it like this. The machine will finish its run 4 days from now, on the present 24-hour day basis. The transport calls in a week, okay? Then all we need to do is to find something that needs replacing during one of the overhaul periods. Something that will hold the works for a couple of days. We'll fix it, of course, but not too quickly. If the time matters properly, we can be down at the airfield when the last name pops out of the register. They won't be able to catch us then. I don't like it, said George. It'll be like the first time I ever walked out on a job. Besides, it would make them suspicious. No, I'll sit tight and take what comes. I still don't like it, he said. 7 days later, as the tough little mountain ponies carried them down the winding road. And don't you think I'm running away because I'm afraid. I'm just sorry for those poor old guys up there, and I don't want to be around when they find out what suckers they've been. Wonder how Sam will take it. It's funny, replied Chuck. But when I said goodbye, I got the idea he knew we were walking out on him, and that he didn't care because he knew the machine was running smoothly and the job would soon be finished. After that, well, of course, for him, there just isn't any after that. George turned in the saddle and stared back at the mountain road. This was the last place from which one could get a clear view of the lamasery. The squat, angular buildings were silhouetted against the afterglow of the sunset. Here and there, lights gleamed like portholes on the side of an ocean liner, electric lights, of course, sharing the same circuit as the Mark V. How much longer would they share it, wondered George. Would the monks smash it up the computer in their rage and then disappointment? Or would they just sit down quietly and begin the calculations all over again? He knew exactly what was happening up in there in the mountain at this very moment. The High Lama and his assistants would be sitting in their silk robes, inspecting the sheets as the junior monks carried them away from the typewriters and pasted them into the great volumes. No one would be saying anything. The only sound would be the incessant patter, the never-ending rainstorm of keys hitting the paper. For the Mark V itself was utterly silent as it flashed through the thousands of calculations a second. 3 months of this, thought George, was enough to start anyone climbing up a wall. There she is, called Chuck, pointing down to the valley. Ain't she beautiful? She certainly was, thought George. The battered old DC-3 lay at the end of the runway like a tiny silver cross. In 2 hours, she would be bearing them away to freedom and sanity. It was a thought worth savouring, like a fine liquor. George let it roll down his mind as the pony trudged patiently down the slope. The swift night of the high Himalayas was now almost upon them. Fortunately, the road was very good, as roads ended in that region, and they were both carrying torches. There was not the slightest danger, only a certain discomfort from the bitter cold. The sky overhead was perfectly clear, and ablaze with the familiar, friendly stars. At last, there would be no risk, thought George, of the pilot being unable to take off because of the weather conditions. They had been his only remaining worry. He began to sing, but gave up after a while. The vast arena of mountings, gleaming like wittily hooded ghosts on every side, did not encourage such a jubilance. Presently, George glanced at his watch. Should be there in an hour, he called back over his shoulder to Chuck. Then he added, in an afterthought, I wonder if the computer's finished its run. It was due about now. Chuck didn't reply, so George swung around in his saddle. He could just see Chuck's face, a white oval turned towards the sky. Look, whispered Chuck, and George lifted his head to heavens. There is always a last time for everything. Overhead, without any fuss, the stars were going out. And that was the 1953 short story by Arthur C. Clarke called The 9 Billion Names for God, written in a very Masonic, allegorical, very telling document that is really more about a framework that they had planned for us. And this is why it's such a celebrated short story. And the reason why this is because Arthur C. Clarke was fulfilling basically a brief that extended back to 1939. Now we'll get 37. Now we'll get to that in a minute. But what's important about the story is the factors. That the transitional fate, as you wish, between the theocratic theologian gods and the secular gods of technology is Tibetan monks. Next to the Pope, who is the most high-profile religious figure on this earth that even atheists, in their own funny way, worship? Why, it's the good old Dalai Lama from Tibet, the technocratic Lama, who likes his meat, first-class flying, hotels, celebrities, and his technology. If you think for a second that his purpose is to help free Tibet, you're sorely mistaken. His purpose is to transform us towards a new secular technological religion. That's what the stars going out in the sky in this story symbolize. They symbolize the death of the old gods and the start of the new gods, technology, The allegories are flying in this story. The DC tree has a silver cross at the end of the runway ready to take off. The battered old DC tree. Let that one sink in. The good old Dalai Lama. Everyone has to love him. He started working for the CIA, showing up around the time that these processes were forming into action. I read this story a couple of weeks ago, and I read it as an allegory, and I tried to decipher the language in it, and I knew the story from when I was a kid. It was in a book of science fiction collections I had when I was a kid, and it stood out for a reason. It was a book of the best of British science fiction, something like that. And it stood out like a sore thumb among all the other stories in the book because it wasn't very British. British science fiction tended to be very, very nihilistic, about diseases, tripids, disasters, overbearing, monstrous calamities, zombies, creatures, viruses, infections. American sci-fi tended to be about idealism, adventure, exploration, hope, better future, mankind in the stars. Now remember, Star Trek is not about mankind in space. It's a concept, it's an allegory. Gene Roddenberry, the good Freemason that he was speaking in allegory. The USS Enterprise was business traveling through the commercial world that we live in, where all the races have to work together. That's why it had the first interracial kiss on TV, right in the middle of the terrible 60s in the United States, because science fiction is not about the future. It's about now that was written in the past. Now, we'll begin going right back. H.G. Wells probably wrote the very first science fiction novel when he wrote The Time Machine. Now, The Time Machine, if you look at the original book, the original cover, it has a very strange cover. It has almost like a Babylonian winged lion Egyptian motif, which is a strange thing anyway to have on a book dealing with the future. But the book is quite old now. It's surprising. I was quite amazed when I found out that The Time Machine was written by H.G. Wells in 1895. And again, it was made to quite an interesting film with Rod Taylor, the actor, back in the 1960s. What we're watching. Even if it's a bit Mary Poppins-ish, it's a bit like, oh boy, hell yeah, a lot of that kind of thing. But Rod Taylor was a super actor, and he plays the part quite well. But people have said, oh wow, isn't it amazing how H.G. Wells really predicted the future in that book? No, he was writing out a framework. H.G. Wells is a Fabian. The Fabian Society, as you know, their symbol is the world being shaped like an anvil by people hitting with hammers. Now, the world is not the physical world. It doesn't mean it's giant guys in space hammering the earth with a hammer into shape. It's the consciousness. They're hammering at the consciousness. When books like The Time Machine came out through the Fabians, and there's no doubt they're great reads. You can't doubt H.G. Wells' talent. But what he was giving us was frameworks for the future. Frameworks that they had decided, the Fabians had decided that the human race was to be hammered into, forged into. The anvil of the psyche. Now you know why I picked that. Because the anvil inside our head is not shaped towards our needs, it's shaped towards theirs. H.G. Wells also in 1913, and this is an interesting one, he claimed to be all his life, and his supporters all his life talk about him being a passionate, pacifist, a man who was against wars. But yet, on the eve of World War One, he produced a book in 1913 called Little Wars. Now, Little Wars was basically rules for playing with toy soldiers, not just necessarily aimed at adults, but also at kids too. But it was, sorry, not just the kids, but also at adults, but mainly at children. It was teaching war strategy to the English kids, the middle class in particular, who would have been able to afford tin and lead toy soldiers and little cannons, how maneuvers of infantry and cavalry and artillery work on the battlefield. And it was basically the framework for what we call real-time strategy games today. You had turns and all these kinds of things. Now, if he was an ardent pacifist, why was he creating a book that teaches children how to deal with war? Because they knew that the First World War was coming up. So maybe in his warped way, pacifism was teaching young children to be better soldiers so they'd have less chance of getting killed. Did you know that was also the reason why the Olympic Games were created? I bet you didn't know that one. The Olympic Games were created to create tougher and harder aristocrats among the French elite, following a kind of a psychic breakdown that they had during the Franco-Prussian War. We know the Franco-Prussian War was won by the Prussians because they had an education system, the first state education system. And when the Franco-Prussian War broke out in the 1870s, the French got their asses kicked to the point where the Prussians were on the gates of Paris in no time. The effect that had in France at that period was similar to the Americans after the Vietnam War. They went into basically a psychic breakdown, an emotional breakdown, because they had been beaten so badly against these Prussians, who they believed that they were superior to. And so the Olympic Games was developed, look it up, to create men of French aristocratic stock who wouldn't be mowed down so quickly in the battlefield. And that was the purpose of that. That's why that came about. Just like the Prussians invented the state school system for the same reason. H.G. Wells produced a very popular book, and it's even quite popular this day, Little Wars, to teach young boys the skills of military tactics in their living room for the day when they would need it in the Somme, Passchendaele, Gallipoli, and wherever else they were sent a year later in what they call the Great War. And the book was called Little Wars, which was followed by the Great War. And you think these fuckers don't have an agenda, okay? It's so obvious at times. It's like I feel some days like I'm living in a bad soap opera, like a reality version of EastEnders or Emmerdale. It does feel like that some days. It really does. The script, it'd be like if I went to Coronation Street, right, and I walked into the Rovers, saw the actors all reading their lines, and then the guy said, action, and the cameras rolled, and I go in there ordering a pint, and I think I'm in a real pub. I don't know I'm on a set. That's the world we live in. The actors are constantly reading their lines, rehearsing around us. The directors are saying, action, cut. Quiet on the set. And we as human beings are in this theatre of the absurd. And we think it's all happening by osmosis, by accident, by an organic method. When they produce the real actual scripts in the forms of the 9 billion names of God, Little Wars, The Time Machine, and you go, it's not amazing. Oh, it's not amazing. No, it's not amazing. They're following the script. Now, after this next song, we're going to talk a little bit further about this and how it metamorphosized, developed, and rolled into Arthur C. Clarke and everything we have today from then on. And the final song of the night is Skin Shape and Soul Groove. And that was Skin Shape by Soul Groove, and we're in the final half-hour leg of the Velocity of Now with me, Thomas Sheridan. And we're talking about the science fiction agenda. What is science fiction? What is the purpose of science fiction? Well, it's a script. It's a movie script. And you're in it. This is one of the few things you're in, but they haven't told you this. Now, where this story really begins to take off is when science fiction met rocketry, met movies. And very early on, they were ready to merge the three into our consciousness. One of the first big British, actually, you go back a bit further than that, one of Fritz Lang's early films, Woman in the Moon, the guy who made Metropolis, was probably the very first science fiction film ever made that had a realistic portrayal of space in terms of how space travel functions. Before that, you'd have people going to the moon on balloons and things like that. But this was the first, and the reason why you had Johannes Winkler and Max Belair and a guy called Willy Ley, who were three rocket experts in something called the Verein voor Ruimtevaart, which was basically the VFR, meaning the Society for Space Travel in Germany at the time. They were testing rockets on the outskirts of Berlin, and they approached Fritz Lang with the idea of giving him technical consultancy on his film Woman in the Moon, with the idea of procuring constant funding for the Rocketry program through the German film industry, which is actually, I think, was bigger than Hollywood at that time. It was the biggest film industry in the world, I think, at that time. And that was the idea. So that was really when the phallus of the rocket entered the womb of media, with the idea of one helping the other. Some British officers British rocketeers went over to Germany in this period and saw the potential between entertainment and rocketry, not only in terms of one funding the other, not only in terms of science fiction and space adventure movies being a phenomenal advertisement, quote-unquote, propaganda tool to excite the general public about space travel, about exploration in space, in order to procure increased government and corporate funding and military funding especially into rocketry and space exploration. And in that high mark Masonic year of 1933, the year when Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, when the Reichstag burnt down, when Mount Rushmore was violated and turned into a Freemasonic temple by carving US presidents on top of it. In that high Masonic year of 1933 was also founded the British Interplanetary Society, which was the first and oldest space advocacy agency organization on Earth. Its whole agenda was to promote space travel. This was also seen as a great crossover. Remember, they were situated in South London, right beside the Secret Intelligence Service building. So there you had the Fabians moving between the Interplanetary Society, the Fabians themselves, the Secret Intelligence Services building, and all devising a way to sell the future through rockets. One of the earliest big budget British movies, science fiction movies, and one of the biggest big budget movies ever in early British cinema, was a cinematic version of H.G. Wells' Things to Come. Now, Things to Come, again, was, look what the future brings. And people have to think like, I have to do it. But that's what they knew right away. They were future-proofing. Right back to the beginning of the show. Remember when I was talking about the eclipses? How the eclipses were used by the priesthoods? Because they figured out that an eclipse would happen on a certain time and date. Future-proofing their own power. And science fiction was key to this. To create the script, the narrative, the plot line for you, the human race. Because everything you know has to move forward. Remember, it's evolution. Evolution doesn't exist. The survival of the fittest doesn't only exist in terms of biology and species, but exists in terms of you and technology. If you don't embrace the phallus of the rocket going into space, you'll be wiped out because your species, your backward Luddite species, will be wiped out. Very, very clever stuff. Now, in Things to Come, there's several core issues within the story and the movie. First core issue is the abolition of all nations. The belief that all nations and all independence, if it is abolished and eradicated, we will have an end to war. That was the first agenda. So the first agenda was to end all wars. Nationalism was the cause of all wars. So it was a globalist message was the first one. The second message was that technology was the answer to everything. Technology was the answer to human beings had to merge with the machine at some level. This was also featured in Fritz Lang's Metropolis as well, although in a more darker, nihilistic way, in a far more mature way. But remember, he wasn't working for the Nazis because they didn't exist at the time that he was going. He went straight to Hollywood. However, I made some very good films like Scarlet Street. Now, the H.G. Wells version of cinema, the British cinema version, made no bones about this. And they had the last ever nation. It's really funny, folks, when you see the scene where the last rogue state is brought down. And the rogue state guys are portrayed as almost like barbarians, even though he has a World War II kind of British helmet on him and a rifle and a machine gun. He wears furs like a savage. And beside him he has this piece of ass, the skirt, and she's like a bit of tail. And when she's up for it, she'd give herself to any man. She's not a lady. And it's exactly the way the likes of Saddam Hussein and, Gaddafi and all the other warlords have always been treated by the media as being savages on some level. And the only women that would be with them would be whores. And so anyway, how do they get rid of them? Well, the last one, they fly this organization called Wings Over the World, who are kind of an airborne United Nations. And wait for it, they fly over nations spraying the gas of peace. The jets, no, not actually jets, they're big propeller planes, spray out of their tails, out of their engines, the gas of peace. And the gas of peace doesn't kill the people. It makes them fall asleep. And they fall asleep on the gas of peace. So the armies can move in and take their guns off them. And then they wake up and they have a new leadership. And there's a scene in the book and the movie where the leader, the guy who's the leader of the rogue nation, he actually is killed. And the guy from the leader of Wings Above the World, he stands there and he looks at the camera and it's like, there's this kind of Shakespearean posture, and he goes, yes, he's dead and his world is dead with him. His world is we are now able to move forward. All men working as one, under the guise of Wings Over the World, a Freemasonry of the skies. He actually used that term, a Freemasonry of the skies. And then the film moves on to its next agenda, which is the automation of human society, ultimately leading towards a rocket to space. So you have this massive, incredible automation, electronics, engineering, the works, people walking in very pristine, kind of brutalistic architecture And Fritz Lang played on that as well in Metropolis. And at the very end, they built the rocket to go into space, and this tosser gives another speech, about like, oh, to the stars, oh, and all this crap. And there's this like fella and a civilized bird, a civilized piece of tail, goes off into space. Now, the only ones who protest against it are the artists. Aha. They knew that people who were creative were going to be the biggest problem for the technocratic society. They needed followers, machine men, as Charlie Chaplin tried to warn us about in that amazing speech at the end of The Great Dictator. They wanted machine men. But the creative soul, the artist, the free thinker, that was the ones who were the biggest problem in things to come. Now, the British Interplanetary Society, as I said, was founded in 1933, that phenomenal Masonic year in Liverpool, Space Advocacy Agency, with a nice little badge, little rocket thing on it, that looks kind of, if you kind of think about it, a little bit kind of could be seen as a Masonic compass and square, kind of. I'm not going to say that. Anyway, these chappies decided that somehow along the line, the British were not going to have a space program. I don't know why it didn't happen. It didn't happen. The Americans took over, after the Nazis, of course. Now, a very significant event took place in Leeds, in England, in Yorkshire, in 1937, where they had the very, very first gathering of what they called the British Science Fiction Association. And it was held in Leeds at the Theosophists Hall. The Theosophical Hall in Leeds on the 3rd of January 1937. Well, as we all know, the Theosophy Society, or the Theosophical Society, is rooted in creating the new age, the age of Lucifer, the abolishment of all former religions, and the embracing of a kind of a new age Luciferian. Now remember, when I say Lucifer, I'm not talking about the devil here. Lucifer is a different thing altogether. We could do a whole other show on that. Future. 20 people attended, and believe it or not, there was even an invitation extended to H.G. Wells, but he was getting on by then and he couldn't make it. Now, one of the people who appeared at this was a guy called Ted Carnell. Ted Carnell was a Mason, and basically his idea was he was going to become an editor. Now, see, these weren't science fiction fans meeting because of a love of science fiction. These were fellas meeting to plan the future. And among them was this guy, Carnell, who became an editor, and he launched the career of Arthur C. Clarke, Michael Moorcock, and J.G. Ballard, and a few others. And that's what British science fiction was based upon. They had their first main meeting open to the public 3 years later in 1930 in London, in Ilford. And guess who was the chairman? Leslie Johnson of what? The British Interplanetary Society. The two things were working hand in hand together to create a consciousness. Things to come. Now, as we know, the British space program, it never went anywhere. The American space program became the dominant one in this part of the world. Of course, you could say the Russians were up there too, just as equally good. But on this part of the world, the relationship between cinema, mass media, or the entertainment industrial complex, and space exploration via science fiction is, oh my God, it's like saying there's no link between grapes and wine, or vineyards and wine. They are one and of the same thing. As above, so below. How many times do you have to say that to you? As above, so below. Now, British science fiction went in a completely different direction than American science fiction, for the simple reason was British space exploration was over. And the powers that be in the UK were much more interested in creating a sense of engineered hopelessness in the British public. So that's why they got dark, nihilistic versions of the future, diseases, pandemics, cannibalism. Still goes on, actually, to this day in British science fiction. Engineered hopelessness, that the future was a bleak and a dark and a foreboding place, because they had to get the British public used to the austerity years of the post-war era. So people would actually think, well, we won World War II alongside with the rest of the Allies. How come the Americans are all having a great time and we're living in the shit? Nothing's got any better. But they were given stories, science fiction stories, to show you that the future was shit anyway. So you're only living what the script that you're given to you has decreed, has laid out. You build the anvil in the psyche, you change the consciousness, and you get exactly what you want from the population. Now, the Americans, on the other hand, because they came through World War II completely unscathed, in fact, in a much better position in every way than when they went in, well, their space exploration program rocketed, pardon the pun, after World War II, when all the Nazi scientists came over during Operation Paperclip. What's American science fiction like by comparison? Well, it's good-looking chaps going through the stars, picking up hot space chicks on other planets, and it's the Wild West in outer space, exploration, the new frontier. Everything is possible. It took off where the Fabian British thing took over, because Britain lost its power after the World War II. The focus of world power shifted to the United States. Therefore, the science fiction in the United States had to be very different. It had to be positive. It had to be healing in terms of bringing different social and ethnic groups together. It had to be, sell virtues, that lovely Freemasonic term, virtue. They had to sell virtue in terms of, we might have to fight these aliens, but it's a good thing. And that continues on to this day with shite-like films like Avatar. Absolute crap. That film, Avatar, is an absolute pile of crap. But there's this whole agenda that, we have to be sacred to the Na'vi. They're so in touch with... No, the real story of that is NATO is always fucking coming. That's the story behind Avatar. NATO is, you got shit, we're coming with our bombs and rockets, and that's the end of it. Now, British science fiction is still in the my list. You look at films like, what was it, 28 Days Later, 28 Months Later. They're all shitty. They're the same cannibals, people hacking their heads off and all this kind of thing. Now, in America, you have horror in that format. Like, you'd have the George Romero films, The Day of the Dead, Dawn of the Dead, The Zombies. But they're not about the future. Where the British the British zombie films are very much in the science fiction genre. The script has been laid out for about 100 odd years. Probably about 103 or 104 years. We've been following an agenda based on future-proofing the human consciousness that they want, and they've been using science fiction to do it. You have films like The Day After Tomorrow, where they showed the global warming thing happening. And of course it froze up. You have films like that. Always future-proofing. The alien agenda, this false notion, the religion of the day that people actually believe aliens have visited this planet, is completely and totally a fallacy built upon space aliens and spaceships coming down in spaceships in films, from everything from Invaders from Mars back in the 1950s through to, they're going to remake, what's that awful film, Independence Day, with that, no talent, the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air guy. It rolls on. It rolls on. This is why people, and you think to yourself, no one really buys into this shite. Well, but folks, they do. Because you function on two levels. You function on a consciousness level and a subconscious level. And we look at those people and are standing in line for their iPods. They're standing in line for their iPods in the freezing rain till all hours of the night and day to get the latest iPhone. And we laugh at them and we don't get it. That's because on the subconscious level, they want to be like Mr. Spock, or they want to be like Captain Kirk. The science fiction programming has worked. Just like it's worked on the people who believe in the reptilians rubbish, they got that from V. It can totally trace a line right back to the original broadcast of V. That's where it comes from. A woman had her face pulled off. You saw a reppy underneath. Oh, it's true. I'm not a sheeple. I'm a truther. I'm not a sheeple. I'm not a sheeple who sits at home and watches EastEnders and does what, Dot Cotton says. No. I believe the Queen is a shape-shifting reptilian because I saw her on V. But I'm not a sheeple. You get how powerful that stuff is now? I'm not putting anyone down. You're entitled to your own life and your own beliefs. But you see how powerful that stuff is. It's more powerful than you'll ever realize. This is why they pay Hollywood directors, actors, and those clever people who do the CGI incredible salary packages. Because these are creating the new versions of humanity going forward. They're literally building a new reality, quantum element, but bit by bit in front of you, spooling it into the future so you fit right into it, like a hand into a glove or a foot into a sock. Seamless transition between the script and your life. And you talk about freedom. But the program is breaking. The program is breaking because people are waking up properly. Now, I know there's different stages of waking up. The first stage of waking up, you might actually believe the aliens bullshit and the reptilians bullshit, and then you realise, well, that's bollocks too as well. I've been predictably programmed through that as well. You move beyond. And you come to an almost like the state of a postmodernist Luddite. And you realise that, well, feck this. If I'm actually going to achieve anything here, it's going to be on a one sort of piecemeal way, bit by bit. Now, they also use the science fiction to tell you the plans on the bad side too. Logan's Run, for instance. And lots of many other things. The Terminator movies. Doesn't matter what happens in the Terminator movies. Arnold Schwarzenegger goes back in time and saves X amount of people. What happens? It doesn't change the fact that in the future the humans are still wiped out by the robot machines. We are made obsolete by the drones that can walk instead of fly. But if you can break out of that and you can shift your focus, you can build a reality away from it that's not dependent on it. I spoke a few weeks ago about the monomyth. It all ties in the same thing. Do you want to sit there, and I guarantee you 3,000-4,000 years ago it happened, when the high priest said, in 15 minutes that we will make the sun go black. There may have been 900 people there who went, oh God, they're making the sun go black. Well, I can guarantee you there was 10 misfits, 10 gobshites, 10 conspiracy theorists like you and I who sat there and said, these fuckers have figured out something about how this has worked. I'm Thomas Sheridan. This is the velocity of now. I'll see you in 2 weeks. And remember, fuck them if they can't take a joke. And you don't have to follow their script ever. Thank you. Good night. God bless. And I'll see you in 2 weeks.